The storm outside the citadel did not simply fall from the sky that night. It felt as if the heavens were being torn open on purpose, as though something ancient was trying to be heard again after centuries of silence. And inside the great throne chamber of the Iron Dominion, where marble pillars rose like frozen spears and torchlight trembled against gold-lined walls, a single girl stood barefoot on the cold obsidian floor, while every blade in the room pointed at her without being drawn. She was soaked from the rain that had followed her in, her dark hair clinging to her face, her breathing steady in a way that did not match her position as a prisoner. And yet, what made every guard hesitate was not her appearance, but the way she looked directly at the throne as if she had been expecting it her entire life. Seated high above her was Lord Cale Viramont, the Dominion's unchallenged ruler, a man whose name alone had ended rebellions before swords were even raised, whose gaze had silenced councils and whose judgment had never once been questioned without consequence. Yet now his expression was unreadable as he studied her like an unsolved equation that refused to behave logically. The chamber had been summoned for a trial, yet no one spoke the word. Because the moment she had been dragged in by the guards, she had lifted her head and said it with absolute certainty. The moon chose me for him. And the reaction had not been fear, not outrage, not disbelief in the usual sense, but something far worse, silence so heavy it felt alive, followed by a ripple of uneasy laughter from the lower courtiers that died too quickly to be real, as though even laughter was afraid to linger. And still she stood there, unbroken, her wrists bound in silver chain etched with runes meant to suppress magical alignment. But the chains were subtly trembling now, not from her movement, but from something responding to her presence. The guards tightened their grip, and one of them hissed for her to kneel, but she did not move, instead tilting her head slightly as though listening to something none of them could hear. And that was when Cale finally leaned forward just enough for the torchlight to catch the sharp edge of his expression. And instead of ordering her execution or demanding proof, he did something no one expected. He looked away, not in dismissal, but in restraint, as if looking at her for too long would fracture something inside him that had taken years to control. And that single action sent a colder dread through the room than any sword ever could, because the ruler who never hesitated had just hesitated over her. If you were standing in that chamber, watching a girl claim she was chosen by a celestial force no one had acknowledged in centuries, and watching the most dangerous man alive refuse to react the way power demanded, would you believe her and risk everything? Or would you choose silence and survive the night? Because that is the question that hung in the air heavier than the storm itself. A question that would decide not just her fate, but the fate of everyone who had ever ignored the moon's name. She finally spoke again, softer this time, not to the guards, not to the court, but to him. You already know. And the words were not accusation, but recognition. And that was when the first crack appeared in the illusion of control Cale Viramont had built his entire rule upon. Because the truth was, she had not come here by accident. She had been sent under the cover of a diplomatic escort that never arrived, her real identity buried beneath forged records and erased affiliations, trained not just in combat but in reading the unseen currents of power that flowed through ancient bloodlines, and her mission, hidden even from most of her handlers, was to locate the source of a growing anomaly across the Dominion. Entire villages where people marked by lunar resonance had vanished without record, without bodies, without explanation, and every path of investigation had led here, to the Iron Citadel itself, to the man who now refused to meet her eyes directly. Cale finally stood, and the sound of it was enough to make every guard straighten, yet he did not approach her, instead circling slowly from the throne as though distance itself was a form of control he was trying to maintain. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, almost indifferent, but beneath it was something strained. "There is no moon here. There are no chosen, there is only law. And yet, even as he said it, something in the chamber responded, a faint shimmer in the air near her chains, like moonlight reflecting where no light source existed, and one of the senior advisors shifted uncomfortably, whispering to another that the old protocols had forbidden even the mention of lunar selection within the palace walls, a prohibition enforced not by decree, but by fear. She took a step forward, despite the chains, despite the guards. Nan, and the moment she did, every torch in the chamber flickered as if synchronizing with her heartbeat, and she spoke again, louder this time. Then explain why I am alive. And no one answered, because the records were clear. Every previous claimant of lunar selection had died before reaching adulthood. Every trace of them wiped from historical archives. Every prophecy sealed beneath royal cipher. Yet she stood here breathing, speaking, defying the silence that had consumed them all. Kale's gaze finally snapped back to her, sharper now, more dangerous. And for the first time, something like recognition flickered behind his restraint. Not of her identity, but of the impossibility she represented. And in that moment, the guards received a silent signal that no one spoke aloud, but everyone understood. Each tightening their formation as if preparing for something far more dangerous than a prisoner. Because if she was telling the truth, then the Dominion was already in violation of something far older than law. Deep beneath the throne chamber, hidden mechanisms that had not been activated in centuries began to stir faintly, reacting to her presence in ways no one in the room could yet see, and she felt it. Her eyes briefly shifting upward as if sensing movement beneath stone and steel, while Kale noticed that shift and for the first time fully faced her, not as a prisoner, not as a threat, but as an unknown variable that had already begun rewriting the rules of the room. And he spoke again, quieter now, almost dangerously controlled. If you are lying, you will not leave this chamber alive. But she only smiled faintly, not in defiance, but in certainty, because whatever fear they thought they held over her had already been eclipsed by something far older calling from beyond the storm. And as thunder cracked outside again, shaking the stained glass high above them and casting fractured moonlight across the floor despite the clouds, she finally said the words that shifted everything, the words that turned silence into fracture. I did not come here to be believed. I came because the moon does not wait forever. And in that instant, something in Kale's expression finally broke. Not into fear, not into anger, but into the smallest, most controlled recognition of a truth he had spent his entire life refusing to accept. And somewhere deep in the palace, unseen by all of them, a sealed chamber that had remained locked for generations began to unlock itself. Responding to a name that had just been spoken aloud again for the first time in centuries, while above it all, the storm continued, as if the sky itself was holding its breath, and the girl who claimed she had been chosen by the moon stood unshaken in the center of a room that had just stopped being certain of anything it believed about power, prophecy, or the man who ruled them all. The moment the doors of the throne chamber sealed shut behind her, the sound was not just a closing, it was a finality, like a verdict being locked into stone, and the girl who had claimed the moon chose her for him stood in the corridor between two worlds, one where she was still technically alive under the protection of protocol, and another where her existence had already become a problem too dangerous to ignore. The guards no longer spoke to her, not out of respect, but out of uncertainty. Because there was something about the way she had not broken under Kale Viramont's gaze that made even trained soldiers feel like they were standing too close to an edge they could not see. She could feel their eyes on her back as she was escorted through the inner passageways of the Iron Citadel, where the walls themselves seemed to absorb sound and light, where every corridor felt designed not just for defense, but for psychological submission, and yet she walked without resistance. Her wrists still bound in runes that hummed faintly against her skin, not weakening her, but reacting to her in subtle, almost curious pulses. Somewhere above them, thunder rolled again, and for a brief second the stone ceiling vibrated as though responding to something far beyond weather. And she lifted her head slightly, not in fear, but in recognition, as if she were listening to a conversation no one else had been invited into. One of the guards finally broke the silence with a low mutter about how she should have been executed on sight, but the words lacked conviction, and even he seemed to realize it the moment he said them, because execution required certainty, and there was nothing certain about her. They led her past sealed doors marked with ancient sigils, past observation alcoves where nobles once watched executions like performances, and past archives that had been intentionally stripped of certain records, the absence itself becoming its own form of language. And she noticed all of it, cataloging without effort, because her mind had been trained for patterns that most people never learned to see. But beneath all of that observation, beneath the controlled breathing and steady posture, there was something heavier pressing at the edges of her awareness. The question that had followed her since the moment she first saw the iron citadel rising like a blade against the horizon. If the moon truly had chosen her, why did every system built by men insist on denying it with such violent precision? And more importantly, what did it mean that the one man powerful enough to silence entire kingdoms had not ordered her death immediately? The guards halted at a junction where the corridor split into three paths, each one leading deeper into restricted sectors of the palace, and for the first time since her arrival, she was not immediately pushed forward, because there was hesitation now in the chain of command. A delay that revealed something no one intended to show her. They were waiting for instructions from above, and that meant Cale Viramont was still deciding what she was. And in that pause, she finally spoke. Not to them, but into the space itself, as though addressing something beyond the stone walls. If I am wrong, then I die, and nothing changes. But if I am right... She stopped there, letting the silence stretch, because the weight of what came next did not belong to her alone. It belonged to every person who had ever looked at something impossible and chosen not to believe it. And one of the guards instinctively tightened his grip on her chain, as if silence itself had become dangerous. She turned her head slightly toward him, not threatening, not pleading, but studying him with an unsettling calm, and asked softly, "What do you think happens to a kingdom that kills what it refuses to understand?" And the question landed harder than any accusation, because it was not about her. It was about them, about every soldier, every advisor, every silent witness who had chosen order over truth their entire lives without ever being forced to justify it. The guard did not answer, because there was no answer that did not implicate him. The group began moving again, but slower now, as if the corridor itself had become heavier, and she felt it then. The subtle shift in the citadel's rhythm, like a heartbeat misfiring somewhere beneath the structure. And she knew, without being told, that something had changed since she spoke her claim in the throne chamber. Something irreversible had begun to unfold, not because anyone had acted, but because something had been acknowledged. And that was when the question truly formed in her mind, not as doubt, but as a deliberate confrontation she would one day have to force upon the world. What do you do when the truth is not hidden because it is unknown, but because it is inconvenient to power, and who decides whether a revelation is sacred destiny or punishable madness? Ahead of her, a door marked with black iron sigils opened automatically as they approached, and the guards hesitated again before ushering her through into a holding chamber that was too clean, too controlled, too intentionally empty, as though even the concept of waiting had been engineered to feel like punishment, and she was left standing there as the door sealed behind her, the guards remaining outside, but visible through the reinforced glass panel, and their presence now more observation than containment. And in that isolation, She allowed herself to breathe fully for the first time since entering the citadel, and it was then that the memory of the moment she spoke in the throne chamber replayed in her mind. Not the words, not even Kale's reaction, but the silence that followed. Because silence, she realized, was never empty here. It was structured, curated, enforced, and yet her words had fractured it. She stepped closer to the glass, looking at her reflection layered over the guards beyond it, and for a brief instant she saw not just a prisoner or an anomaly, but something else entirely. Something that did not belong to the systems that were trying to contain her. And the realization was unsettling even to her, because she had been trained to understand control, hierarchy, and manipulation, yet nothing in her training accounted for what it meant when the structure itself began reacting to a single claim. Above her, somewhere deep within the citadel's upper levels, she felt rather than heard movement, footsteps that were not rushed but deliberate, measured, approaching something unseen, and she understood immediately that Kale Viramont had not dismissed her, not even slightly, because men who dismiss threats do not send silent observation teams to monitor empty holding chambers. The real danger, she realized, was not that she might be executed for her claim, but that she might be correct. Because correctness in a system built on denial was not rewarded, it was eliminated. And that led her to the thought she had been avoiding since the moment she crossed the citadel gates. If the moon truly had chosen her for him, then him was not just Kale Viramont as a ruler, but Kale Viramont as a barrier, a gatekeeper between something ancient and something deliberately suppressed. And that meant she was not standing in a political conflict, but in something far older and far more deliberate. Her chains gave a faint pulse again, and she looked down at them with quiet focus, realizing they were not merely suppressing power, but measuring it, responding to fluctuations she had not yet consciously expressed, and that meant the Citadel already knew more about her than she had revealed. The question then was no longer whether she was chosen or delusional, but something far more dangerous. If the moon had truly marked her, in was the Dominion's greatest fear her existence, or the truth she carried simply by being alive. The door behind the guards opened briefly and closed again, and she caught a fragment of whispered exchange, something about lunar resonance spikes and protocol breach thresholds, words that meant nothing to most people but confirmed everything she suspected, that her presence had already escalated beyond containment and into classification. She turned away from the glass, walking slowly to the center of the room, and for the first time allowed the full weight of the situation to settle, not on her fear, but on her responsibility. Because if she was right, then silence was not survival. It was complicity, and every person in this citadel, from guard to king, was already making a choice about her truth, even if they never spoke it aloud. And so the question that now lingered was not just hers, but one she would eventually force upon every level of this kingdom, whether they were ready or not. When something impossible stands in front of you and refuses to break under the weight of your disbelief, do you destroy it to preserve your understanding of the world? Or do you accept that the world you understood was never complete in the first place? And if the moon has already chosen someone you refuse to believe in, how long can you keep pretending the sky itself is wrong before it stops answering you altogether? The decision was not announced with ceremony, nor was it delivered in the grand hall where decrees were usually carved into law before witnesses, because assignments of this nature were never meant to be witnessed at all. Instead, it came in silence, in motion. Nears in the form of a sealed black carriage that arrived beneath the lowest tier of the Iron Citadel long after midnight, when even the most loyal guards had begun to question whether anything in the palace still obeyed the natural order of time, and she was taken from the holding chamber without warning, the rune chains still faintly active around her wrists. Their glow dimmer now but more precise, as though they had completed their initial assessment and were no longer uncertain about her nature. No explanation was given as she was escorted through descending corridors that she had not been permitted to see during her initial arrival, passages carved deeper than the throne level, where the architecture shifted from ceremonial grandeur to utilitarian precision, where the stone was no longer polished but reinforced, and where every step echoed with the sense that sound itself was being monitored. She did not resist, because resistance implied ignorance of purpose, and by now she understood that she was no longer being treated as a prisoner awaiting judgment, but as an anomaly being relocated within a system that had already begun to redefine her role. The guards who accompanied her did not speak, but their silence was different from the silence of the throne chamber. It was procedural, not fearful, as though they had already been briefed on what she was and were now simply executing instructions they did not need to understand. When they reached the lower transit gate, the air itself changed, becoming colder, denser, laced with faint metallic undertones that suggested proximity to older machinery buried beneath the citadel. Systems that predated current governance, and she felt it immediately, the subtle resonance shift in her chains, as if they were reacting to proximity to something similar to themselves. Something older, something designed with the same language of control. The carriage waiting for her was not ornate, nor did it bear insignia of rank, which was itself a message, because in a place where symbolism dictated hierarchy, absence of identity was a form of classification reserved for only one category: operations that did not officially exist. She was guided inside without ceremony, and the moment the doors sealed, the interior illuminated faintly with embedded lunar thread conduits, thin glowing lines tracing the interior like veins of controlled light. And she realized this was not transportation in the conventional sense, but containment in motion. Opposite her sat a single figure, hooded, unmoving, their face obscured not by shadow but by intentional optical distortion embedded in their attire, a technology designed not to hide identity from the naked eye, but to disrupt recognition at the cognitive level. And when they spoke, their voice carried a layered modulation that suggested multiple filters were being applied in real time to prevent tracing. "You will be transferred under Directive Null Crescent." And the words were not explained, not softened, not justified, because justification was unnecessary when authority assumed comprehension. She studied them without speaking, and after a brief pause, they continued. "Your designation has been revised. You are no longer classified as claimant anomaly. You are now designated as Lunar Asset Containment Operative Candidate." And the phrasing itself revealed something critical. Not only that her claim had been acknowledged at a bureaucratic level, but that it had been absorbed into an existing framework she had never been informed existed. The carriage began moving without audible mechanical activation, as if responding to a command transmitted through proximity rather than input, and she felt the citadel recede above them as they descended further into regions that were not on any public map. She finally spoke, her voice steady but deliberate. "If I am an asset, then who owns me?" And the figure opposite her did not react immediately, which was its own form of answer, because hesitation in structured systems often meant the truth was being translated into something permissible. "No one owns you," they replied eventually, "but your existence is now under jurisdictional custody of the Dominion's Lunar Compliance Directorate." And the words should have meant reassurance, but instead, they revealed scale. This was not about her as an individual. It was about classification of phenomena that challenged the Dominion's historical narrative. As the carriage continued its descent, she felt the chains on her wrists subtly adjust again, recalibrating, and she realized they were no longer just suppressing her, but synchronizing with the environment around her, as if preparing her for conditions she had not yet encountered. The hooded figure reached forward and placed a thin crystalline tablet between them, its surface activating without touch, projecting fragmented data streams into the air, maps of regions marked with lunar anomalies, disappearance reports, and sealed incident logs redacted at multiple layers of authority, all converging toward a pattern that was no longer random, and at the center of that pattern was a recurring classification: unregistered lunar resonance subject, terminated prior to full activation. She felt something tighten in her chest that was not fear but recognition, because the data did not describe isolated deaths. It described systematic removal, and the consistency suggested coordination at a level far beyond rogue enforcement. "These are the missing," she said quietly, and the figure did not deny it, which meant acknowledgement without permission. "They were never meant to reach maturation," the figure replied. "Their resonance destabilizes governance structures." And that sentence revealed the underlying philosophy of the Dominion in a way no public decree ever had. The moon was not merely a celestial influence in their understanding, it was a variable that could undermine control if left unregulated. The carriage slowed, and the walls around them shifted from metal reinforcement to stone again. But this stone was different. Older, uncarved, embedded with faint luminous veins that pulsed irregularly, as though responding to her presence. When the doors finally opened, she was not brought into a courtroom or cell, but into a subterranean transit hub where multiple sealed corridors extended outward like arteries, each marked with symbols that predated current script systems, and waiting there were 3 additional figures. Is each dressed in variations of the same distortion-laced attire, their presence suggesting oversight committee rather than escort. She stepped out without hesitation, and immediately the resonance in her chains intensified, no longer subtle, now clearly responsive, as if the environment itself was confirming something about her that the Dominion had been trying to quantify. One of the new figures spoke. "You have been selected for field verification under controlled infiltration parameters." And that phrase changed everything, because it meant she was no longer being contained for observation, but deployed. She turned slightly toward them, her expression unchanged. "Deployed where?" And after a pause, the answer came. "The Eclipsed Corridor," a name that carried weight even without context. And because all 3 of the accompanying figures reacted subtly upon saying it, as though even speaking it required caution, she understood then that she was not being trained for survival inside the Citadel, but for entry into spaces the Citadel itself considered too unstable to regulate directly. The mission was outlined without emotion. Infiltrate a hidden lunar resonance convergence site located beyond sanctioned territory. Identify the source of mass disappearances. Retrieve or neutralize any artifacts linked to uncontrolled lunar synchronization, and report directly to the Directorate through sealed channels that bypassed standard command structures. But beneath the procedural language was something unspoken that she could feel in the way none of them would meet her gaze directly for more than a second. The expectation that she might not return, or worse, that she might return changed in ways that could not be reversed. As they moved her toward preparation chambers, she caught fragments of conversation between the operatives, references to prior candidates, none of whom had completed full corridor traversal, and she noted the pattern without outward reaction because understanding mortality statistics in operational environments was part of her training long before she ever stepped into the Citadel. Inside the preparation chamber, she was fitted with new equipment: lighter restraints, adaptive armor woven with lunar dampening threads, and a compact resonance regulator designed not to suppress her entirely, but to keep her within measurable thresholds. And as each piece was attached, she could feel the system negotiating with her body rather than simply restraining it. One of the technicians hesitated briefly before activating the regulator, and she caught the flicker of uncertainty in their expression, the brief moment where procedure conflicted with instinct, and she realized even those who enforced the system were not fully convinced of its certainty anymore. When the process was complete, she stood still for a moment, sensing the shift. Not in strength, but in perception, as if the world around her had become slightly more transparent, revealing layers of structure she had not been able to see before. The hooded figure returned briefly, delivering final instruction. You will not refer to yourself as chosen. You will not speak of lunar designation outside authorized contexts. In the corridor, you are only verification unit Theta 7. And she looked at them for a long moment before replying. And if the moon does not recognize that name? And the silence that followed was not interrupted, because even they did not have a procedural response for that possibility. She was led to the final transit gate, where the corridor beyond curved downward into darkness that did not reflect available light sources, and as she stood at its threshold, she understood fully that this was not just a mission, but an attempt by the Dominion to convert something uncontrollable into something operational. Thaw, and, as the seal mechanisms began to open, and the air beyond shifted with a pressure that felt almost like a heartbeat waiting to be acknowledged, she realized the most important truth had not yet been spoken aloud by anyone in authority. They were not sending her to investigate the moon's influence. They were sending her to determine whether it could be stopped, and whether she herself was proof that it already could not be. Cale Viramont did not appear where people expected him to appear, because expectation was a form of predictability he had spent most of his life dismantling in others. Instead, he was already present in the lower observation sanctum long before the records flagged his arrival, standing behind a lattice of one-way obsidian glass that overlooked the preparation corridors beneath the iron citadel, watching without movement as the operation surrounding the girl unfolded like a controlled breach of reality itself. From that vantage point, he did not look like a ruler in the traditional sense of someone surrounded by symbols of power or ritual authority, but rather like a man placed deliberately inside the architecture of control, as though he had been engineered to be part of the citadel's function rather than its occupant. And perhaps that was why so many people who served under him found it difficult to describe him afterward, because nothing about him settled into easy categories like tyrant or savior or reformer. Behind him stood two members of the inner advisory circle, both of whom maintained careful distance not out of fear alone, but out of something more complicated: caution shaped by experience. Due because proximity to Cale Viramont did not guarantee protection, only relevance, and relevance could be revoked without warning. On the other side of the glass, the preparation chamber was active, filled with procedural motion as the girl was fitted with field-grade lunar dampening systems and classified transit equipment, her presence marked in official logs now as Lunar Asset Containment Operative Candidate Theta 7, though Cale did not use that designation when he spoke, because he rarely used designations at all unless they served a purpose beyond administration. Instead, he simply observed her, and what he observed was not the chaos others expected from someone who had stood in his throne chamber and declared herself chosen by a force that the Dominion had spent centuries erasing from credible discourse, but control, measured, adaptive, unnervingly stable control, the kind that did not come from training alone, but from something internal that resisted destabilization under pressure. One of the advisors finally broke the silence with careful restraint. "She should have been eliminated at the threshold, my lord." And the words were not rebellion, but procedure, because that was how the Citadel functioned. Every decision could be justified through precedent, and precedent always favored containment through termination when anomalies exceeded acceptable variance thresholds. Cale did not look at the advisor when he answered, "And yet, she is still here." And that single sentence carried more weight than a direct order, because it reframed the situation not as a failure of protocol, but as a deviation in reality that required interpretation. He shifted slightly, his gaze never leaving the chamber below, where the girl was now being fitted with the resonance regulator, and something in his expression tightened. Not outwardly, not visibly, but in the smallest recalibration of attention, like a mind encountering an equation that refused to resolve cleanly under known constraints. Her claim, the second advisor said cautiously, about lunar selection. Do we treat it as delusion or as manufactured signal interference? And there it was. The institutional instinct to categorize the unknown into either psychological failure or external manipulation, because those were the only two explanations that preserved systemic stability. Kale finally turned slightly, not to face them fully, but enough that they could feel the shift in focus. Neither, he said quietly, and that single word unsettled both advisors more than any accusation would have, because it implied a third category the Dominion was not supposed to acknowledge. Below, the girl's chains pulsed faintly again, and Kale noticed it immediately, not because of surveillance instruments, but because he was watching for it. He had been watching for it since the moment she entered the throne chamber, since the first time she spoke the phrase, "The moon chose me for him," because it had not been the content of the claim that interested him, but the timing, the certainty, and the absence of coercion behind it. Most false claimants sought validation, most delusional declarations escalated under scrutiny, but she had not escalated. She had stabilized. The advisors continued speaking in low tones about compliance metrics, containment probability, and corridor mortality rates. But Kale was no longer listening in the conventional sense, because his attention had shifted to the subtle interaction between her presence and the Citadel's deeper systems, systems that most of the Dominion's governing bodies believed were inert relics of older governance eras, but which Kale knew were not entirely dormant. There were places in the Citadel that did not respond to authority, only to resonance, and the girl's arrival had triggered micro-activations in at least 3 sealed subsystems that had not responded to external input in generations. He stepped closer to the glass, and for a brief moment the reflection of the chamber layered over his face, showing him both observer and observed. And that duality was something he had learned to tolerate early in his rule, because leadership at his level required accepting that every act of observation was also an act of exposure. "You are certain," one of the advisors pressed, "that you want her deployed into the eclipsed corridor?" And the question was framed as logistical, but it carried political undercurrents, because the corridor was not just dangerous. It was historically associated with failed containment operations, erased personnel records, and unauthorized lunar convergence phenomena that the Dominion officially classified as myth. Kale did not answer immediately, and in that pause the advisors exchanged a glance that suggested unease, because Kale Viramont did not hesitate unless he was calculating something that did not yet have a defined outcome. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before. "She is not being deployed," he said. And the distinction mattered, because deployment implied control, while what he was describing implied exposure. The advisors frowned slightly but did not interrupt, and Kale continued. "She is being observed in motion." And that sentence reframed the entire operation again, because it revealed that the mission was not about the corridor at all, but about her reaction to it. Below, the final stages of preparation were underway, and Kyle watched as the resonance regulator was activated, noting the subtle shift in her posture as the system attempted to calibrate against her internal state. And for the first time since her arrival, he saw something that did not fit any known classification. The system did not fully suppress her, nor did she fully resist it. Instead, there was negotiation. A dynamic equilibrium forming between containment and acceptance that should not have been possible under standard physiological models. One of the technicians hesitated visibly during the activation sequence, and Kale noticed that hesitation too, because it was not fear. It was recognition of inconsistency, the kind that arises when empirical systems fail to produce expected results. "Her profile does not stabilize," the technician reported quietly, though they were not speaking directly to Kale, and yet everyone in the sanctum knew he was effectively the final recipient of all data regardless of protocol hierarchy. Kale's gaze narrowed slightly. "Define instability," he said. And the question forced the room into silence, because instability was supposed to be measurable. But what they were witnessing was not volatility. It was adaptation. The girl was now fully equipped, standing at the threshold of the transit gate. And even from a distance, Kale could see the subtle shift in how she oriented herself toward the corridor beyond, as if she was not preparing to enter it, but responding to something already calling from within it. The advisors resumed speaking, suggesting contingency protocols, extraction readiness, termination authorization thresholds. But Kale raised a hand slightly, and they stopped immediately, because that gesture did not command attention. It ended discussion. He watched her for a long moment, and then spoke in a tone that was almost conversational, though no one in the room mistook it for casual speech. "Do you know why the moon is forbidden in our records?" he asked, though the question was not directed at anyone present. One of the advisors attempted to respond, but Kale continued without acknowledging them. "Because belief is not the danger," he said, "recurrence is." And that statement introduced a layer of meaning that even his closest circle did not fully grasp, because it implied that the issue was not whether lunar selection was real, but whether it could repeat under conditions the Dominion could not control. He turned back to the glass, watching as the transit gate mechanisms began to open, revealing the dark curvature of the corridor beyond, and for a brief moment something like memory flickered behind his eyes. Not nostalgia, not regret, but recognition of patterns he had seen before, in places the Dominion had already erased from official history. "If she is what the data suggests," one advisor said carefully, "then she is not a containment subject. She is a trigger event." And Kale did not correct them, because for once, the language was close enough to accuracy that correction would only reduce clarity. The corridor beyond the gate was not fully illuminated, but it was not empty either, because light behaved differently there, bending subtly as if drawn toward unseen structure, and Kale noticed the way the girl paused at the threshold. Not in fear, but in synchronization, as though something beyond the corridor had already acknowledged her presence. And in that moment, Kale Viramont understood the most dangerous variable in the entire operation was not the corridor, not the missing subjects, not even the lunar resonance itself, but the possibility that the system they had built to suppress the moon had already failed long before she arrived, and she was not the beginning of a problem, but the first undeniable proof that it had never been solved. The Court of Masks was never announced to exist, because anything that must remain stable in a kingdom built on perception cannot afford to be acknowledged as real. And yet, every person of influence in the Iron Dominion knew, in some quiet and unspoken way, that beneath the ceremonial layers of governance and the visible hierarchy of the Citadel, there was another system operating, one that did not follow rank, bloodline, or decree, but rather information, leverage, and the silent exchange of truths that were too dangerous to speak aloud in daylight. It was into this space that she was brought without explanation. Her identity still registered as Theta 7 in official systems, though the designation had already begun to feel inadequate against what she was experiencing, because the deeper she was taken into the Citadel's lower sanctums, the more the environment itself seemed to shift around her presence, as though even the architecture was adjusting its understanding of who she was. The entrance to the court was not marked, not guarded in the conventional sense, and not revealed until the escort stopped at a section of corridor that appeared structurally identical to all others, yet responded to a sequence of movement that was invisible to untrained perception, and when the wall finally parted, it did not open like a door, but like a decision being made. She was led through without resistance, though every instinct in her body recognized the transition as something deliberate and irreversible, and the moment she crossed the threshold, the air changed, warmer, heavier, layered with scents that did not belong to any single place, but suggested gathering, concealment, and proximity of intent. The Court of Masks was not a chamber in the traditional sense, but a vast subterranean hall carved into circular descent, where tiers of observation platforms spiraled downward toward a central space filled with shifting light sources that had no fixed origin, creating the impression that illumination itself was participating in the concealment of identity. Figures were already present when she arrived, though none of them could be described with certainty, because each attendee wore a mask designed not merely to obscure facial features, but to disrupt recognition at the level of assumption, meaning that even if one saw a shape, a voice, or a posture, the mind refused to anchor it to identity unless explicitly permitted. She was positioned at the upper tier initially, observed rather than integrated, which immediately confirmed to her that her presence here was not ceremonial, but evaluative, and that every movement she made would be interpreted as data rather than behavior. Below her, conversations were already underway, though they did not resemble ordinary speech, because language in the Court of Masks was layered, indirect, and often structured around implication rather than declaration. It with entire exchanges conducted through half-statements that only made sense when combined with prior knowledge held by both parties. She listened carefully, noting references to lunar variance events, unregistered convergent zones, and directive null crescent compliance gaps. All terms that confirm the Dominion's internal acknowledgement of something far more extensive than publicly admitted anomalies, and yet every reference was wrapped in ambiguity, as though even naming the phenomenon too directly risked triggering consequences. Then she heard it, a subtle shift in the rhythm of conversation below, a pause that rippled outward as multiple masked figures turned their attention upward toward her position, not all at once, but in staggered awareness, as though a shared signal had been transmitted without audible input. And she realized she was no longer just observing the court. She was being integrated into its awareness field. A figure stepped forward from the lower tier, their mask smooth and featureless, except for a faint vertical seam that suggested modular construction, and when they spoke, their voice carried a distortion that made it impossible to determine age or origin. "The unmarked subject has arrived," they said, and the phrase caused a subtle reaction across the chamber. Not surprise, but confirmation, as though her presence had been statistically anticipated. She remained still, her posture controlled, but internally cataloging the structure of the room, the exits, the patterns of movement among the masked figures, and most importantly, the points at which attention converged and dispersed. Because in environments like this, observation was not passive, it was reciprocal. She was instructed to descend, and as she moved through the spiraling platforms, she became aware of how the court adjusted itself around her descent. Conversations shifting tone, pauses lengthening, certain figures repositioning subtly to maintain optimal lines of sight without revealing direct interest. When she finally reached the central tier, she was no longer an observer, but a participant in something that did not yet have a defined category in official Dominion classification, and it was there that she saw them, the individuals who had been speaking about her before she even entered the chamber. They were not identified, but their influence was evident in the way others oriented toward them without acknowledgement, the way silence formed naturally around their presence, and the way even masked anonymity did not fully obscure their authority. One of them tilted their head slightly toward her, and though no facial features could be seen, she felt the weight of scrutiny sharpen. "You were not meant to survive entry into the Citadel," the figure said calmly, not as accusation but as observation, and she replied without hesitation, "I was not trying to," which caused a brief ripple of stillness across the immediate circle around them. The exchange that followed was not direct interrogation, but structured probing, with questions layered beneath statements and implications embedded within seemingly unrelated commentary about resource allocation, containment failures, and historical resonance suppression cycles. all of which she recognized as indirect attempts to map her classification without triggering formal acknowledgement protocols. She answered carefully, not revealing more than necessary, but refusing to collapse under ambiguity. And with each response, she noticed subtle recalibration in the way the court engaged with her, as if her coherence under pressure was itself a variable being tested. Then a servant figure, smaller, less adorned, unmasked entirely but marked with neutral insignia, moved through the outer ring of the chamber and delivered something to one of the central figures. A thin, sealed dossier, which was opened without ceremony. Its contents briefly illuminated in faint spectral script only visible to select readers, and the reaction from that reader was immediate but controlled, on a tightening of posture rather than an overt expression. The dossier was passed subtly through adjacent figures, and though she could not see its contents directly, she recognized the pattern of response. Recognition of data that confirmed pre-existing concern. She was not meant to see it, but she saw enough to understand its nature. Fragmented reports of missing lunar resonance subjects, cross-referenced with sealed Citadel records, showing an acceleration pattern that aligned disturbingly with her own timeline of arrival. And for the first time since entering the court, she felt something shift beneath the surface of controlled observation. Not fear, not uncertainty, but confirmation that she was already embedded within a system-wide response cycle she had not been informed of. One of the masked figures finally addressed her directly, stepping closer than protocol would normally allow. "Do you believe yourself chosen?" they asked. And the question was not casual, because in the court of masks, belief was not psychological. It was operational classification. She considered the question carefully before answering, because she understood that any response would be interpreted as data, not sentiment. "I do not believe it," she said finally. "I experience it." And that distinction caused a noticeable shift in the chamber's ambient tension. The figure paused, then responded softly. "Experience is not proof." And she replied, "Neither is denial," which produced no audible reaction, but a measurable stillness spread among several of the surrounding observers, as though multiple systems had paused to reassess. Beneath the central platform, faint, mechanical resonance activated briefly, and she felt it through the structure beneath her feet, a deep pulse that suggested the court was connected to older infrastructural systems embedded within the Citadel, systems that predated current governance frameworks, and possibly even current historical records. A second figure joined the first, and together they began outlining what they referred to as observational context, speaking in layered references to prior lunar anomalies, failed containment candidates, and historical suppression cycles, all of which pointed toward a pattern that was no longer isolated incidents, but structured recurrence. She realized then that the Court of Masks was not merely a political gathering, but an intelligence convergence point where fragmented knowledge of the moon phenomenon was assembled without formal acknowledgement, meaning that everything she had been told in official channels represented only a controlled subset of a much larger suppressed reality. The first figure leaned slightly closer, voice lowering. "You have already altered system behavior by surviving initial contact with Viramont." And at the mention of Kale Viramont's name, she noticed a subtle reaction ripple through several members of the court, not fear, but recalibration, as though his involvement introduced a variable that even they treated with caution. She asked quietly, "Is he part of this court?" And the answer came after a pause. "He is adjacent to all courts, and subject to none," which was not clarification but expansion of mystery. And the chamber's lighting shifted subtly, and she sensed that the evaluation phase was concluding, that she was being categorized not just as a subject, but as a catalyst whose presence would influence future operations regardless of her intended role. And as she stood among masked figures whose identities could not be fixed, Listening to the layered implications of a system that had been operating beneath official awareness for generations, she understood the hidden truth that the Court of Masks could never openly state. The moon was not a forgotten myth or suppressed anomaly. It was an active variable being tracked, contained, and feared, and her existence was not an accident within that system, but a disruption that had already begun forcing every hidden layer of the Dominion to reveal itself, whether it was ready or not. The first sign that something had already gone wrong was not a warning, not an alarm, not even a visible breach in the Court of Masks' structure, but a subtle discontinuity in how attention moved through the chamber, as if the room itself had briefly forgotten how to maintain consistency, and in that single suspended moment she felt it, the shift from observation to containment in reverse, meaning she was no longer being evaluated as a variable within the system, but actively isolated as a threat the system had already begun preparing to eliminate. The masked figures did not move abruptly, because nothing in the Court of Masks ever moved abruptly unless it was already too late. Instead, they simply stopped speaking, one by one, like a wave of silence rolling inward from the outer tiers toward the center. And, in that silence, she saw it reflected in their posture. Recalibration, confirmation, and something colder beneath both of them, authorization. She had seen tactical shifts before. She had been trained to recognize when environments transitioned from passive surveillance to active suppression. But this was different because it was not triggered by aggression or escape attempt, but by information alignment. Somewhere, someone had decided that what she represented could no longer be tolerated as uncertainty. The first physical indication came from the perimeter exits, which did not close loudly or visibly lock, but instead dimmed, the way systems do when they are no longer accepting input from inside, and she understood immediately that the chamber was now sealed not to keep her in, but to prevent anything from interfering with what came next. One of the masked figures at the central tier stepped forward again, but this time their voice carried no ambiguity, no layered distortion of neutrality. "The subject has exceeded tolerance thresholds," they said, and the phrasing was clinical. But the timing revealed something far more important. This decision had not been made in real time, it had been waiting for confirmation. She did not respond immediately, because she was listening not to them, but to everything else in the room. The shift of guards repositioning above the spirals, the faint resonance beneath the platform increasing in frequency, the subtle synchronization of multiple unseen systems aligning around her presence. Then she heard it. A secondary voice, not from the chamber itself, but routed through embedded comm channels within the court's architecture. And it was a voice she recognized before she consciously identified it, because it did not carry the distortion of anonymity. It carried precision, control, and restraint, shaped into something familiar enough to hurt. Cale Viermont. "Proceed with containment protocol," his voice said. Not loud, not emotional, not hesitant. And the absence of hesitation mattered more than anything else, because it confirmed that whatever was happening was not improvisation. It was execution of a pre-existing decision. For a fraction of a second, the Court of Masks reacted, not outwardly, not visibly, but structurally, as several figures subtly adjusted their stance, acknowledging authority that superseded even their anonymity protocols. And she felt it then, not betrayal as emotion, but betrayal as architecture, the sudden collapse of assumed alignment, because Cale Viramont had not been an unknown variable in her mind. He had been the opposing force, the cold ruler who refused her claim, the man whose silence in the throne chamber had felt like restraint rather than denial. And somewhere in the layers of her analysis she had accounted for him as unpredictable, but not actively hostile. That assumption was now gone. Beneath the platform, the resonance systems activated again, but this time not as passive measurement tools, because the sound they produced was no longer passive hum. It was structured alignment, like weapons calibrating. One of the masked figures turned slightly toward her, and for the first time she saw urgency beneath the anonymity. "You were not meant to be brought here alone," they said. And that statement was not warning. It was accusation directed at someone else. She did not need to ask who. The answer was already embedded in Kale's directive. The betrayal was not that he had lied to her, but that he had allowed her to believe she was being evaluated, when in reality, she had been being positioned. The court of masks began to fracture internally, not in chaos, but in division, because systems like this do not break as one unit. They split into factions of interpretation. Some figures began moving away from the center. Others converged toward control points along the spiraling structure, and she realized that her presence had triggered not just containment protocols, but conflict between operational doctrines. One doctrine wanted extraction, another wanted termination, and a third, smaller but more structured, wanted observation continuation under live stress conditions. And somewhere above all of it, Kale Viramont's directive acted as the deciding layer. She took one step backward, not to flee, but to reposition, and that single movement caused a ripple response through the chamber, because now every system was treating her as active participant rather than passive subject. A masked figure closest to her lowered their voice just enough for only her to hear. "This was not supposed to activate until corridor entry," they said, and that detail changed everything, because it confirmed that what was happening now was premature execution of a larger plan. She turned slightly toward them. "What was supposed to happen?" she asked. And for the first time the answer came without procedural language. We stripped of protocol and reduced to something almost human in its hesitation. "You were supposed to reach the eclipsed corridor unaware of what you are." And that sentence revealed the true structure beneath everything. The mission, the court, the citadel, Kale's involvement. All of it had been designed not to test her knowledge, but to observe her reaction to forced self-recognition under controlled collapse conditions. And then the betrayal sharpened further, because she understood that Kale had not simply ordered containment. He had authorized revelation. The court of masks began to shift again, and this time the movement was unified, because a second layer of authority had activated, overriding internal disagreement. And she felt the chamber respond to that override like a living system obeying a higher neural command. From above, mechanical locks engaged across multiple tiers, sealing descent paths, and the resonance beneath her feet increased again, now aligned with structural vibration rather than environmental scanning. She looked upward, and through the shifting light patterns she saw silhouettes repositioning along upper platforms, not rushing, not panicked, but coordinated with practiced efficiency that suggested they had executed similar operations before. Her mind processed rapidly, linking all variables: Kale's voice, the court's reaction, the premature activation of containment protocols, the reference to corridor timing, and the implicit acknowledgement that she had been moved into an active state too early. Which meant only one thing. The system did not fear her arrival. It feared her awareness of timing. When a second communication channel activated within the chamber, this time projected as direct audio rather than routed voice, and Kale Viramont's presence became undeniable, not because he was physically there, but because his authority now overrode environmental systems directly. "All units maintain perimeter," he said, and she could hear something in it that no one else in the room seemed to register. Not anger, not remorse, but containment pressure, like someone holding back a force that had already begun to spread beyond intended boundaries. One of the masked figures near the central tier suddenly spoke, cutting through protocol. "You altered the sequence," they said, directed at Kyle, and that was the first explicit confirmation that even within this hidden structure, he was not universally aligned. There were factions here too. Kale's response came immediately. The sequence was already compromised, and that sentence reframed everything again, because it implied that her arrival had not initiated this collapse. It had revealed it. Beneath her, the resonance systems shifted frequency again, and this time she felt it directly through her chest, not as sound, but as pressure alignment. And she realized with absolute clarity that the court of masks was now transitioning from observation chamber to extraction grid. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It had structure, timing, and execution layers. And Cale Viramont, the man who had looked away from her in the throne chamber, was now actively orchestrating her confinement within a system that predated even his authority. And yet, in the midst of all of it, she noticed something else, something subtle enough that most would miss it entirely. Not all containment systems were converging on her position with equal intent. Some were stabilizing rather than suppressing, which meant there were elements within this operation that were not aligned with termination. The realization was dangerous because it meant she was not just a target in a unified system, but the center of a fractured one. A masked figure moved closer again, this time urgently, breaking protocol entirely. "If you reach the corridor under full activation," they said quickly, "you will not be classified as subject anymore." And they stopped there deliberately, as if the rest of the sentence was too sensitive to complete even under current collapse conditions. She finished it internally anyway. She would become something else entirely. The chamber lights dimmed further, and above them the court of masks began its final structural shift into containment formation, while Kyle Viramont's voice came one last time through the system, quieter now, but heavier than before. "Do not let her reach full resonance alignment," he said. And in that moment she understood the final truth of the setup. This was no longer just about capturing or studying her. It was about preventing her from completing the transformation the moon itself had initiated, and Cale Viramont, the cold, calculating ruler who had refused her claim, was not simply her opposition. He was the gatekeeper of a system trying to decide whether she was the beginning of revelation or the end of control.